Thank you, Evan, for coming. I'm Stu Charlton. I lead the financial services team at CX Partners. And we've got a good session today. It's all about building a consumer duty culture. And I know that with the implementation deadline only a few weeks away, lots of people are feeling a bit weary and a bit stressed right now. And I hope you'll find this session clarifying, maybe energizing. Who knows? You can tell us at the end. We've got two guest speakers. The first is Ed Smith. Ed is the head of the Competition Policy Division at the FCA. And alongside Ed, we've got Jonty Dalal-Small. Jonty's the Behavioural Science Lead at Soprasteria, who are CX Partners' parent company. And this is the second event in our series. I'm going to start with a quick recap of what we covered last time. We discussed how the 31st of July is a deadline and not sadly a finishing line. And that's because the consumer duty is something to embed and not a compliance exercise. So now a transition needs to happen and ownership needs to move from regulatory work streams into the rest of the business. And if we nail that transition, there is an upside to all of this, because when we make things better for customers, they do reward you with their business. But to succeed, we'll need to use the right language. And that means language that those teams will understand and language that will motivate them. And that's why we should talk about customer centricity and continuous improvement. And when you put them together, in this case, that means perfecting the customer feedback loop. Last time we spoke about these things: listening better to customers, using qualitative research to check if customers really understand their options, and to spot consumer harms you might otherwise miss, and improving outcomes sooner using research insights to prioritize the changes you make, and then use rapid prototyping to fail fast and to fail safely. And these are just the component parts of user-centered design. So if you missed that session, and if you'd like a longer recap, I've written it up into a blog. And my colleague Stu Taylor has also written up his thoughts on how firms can test consumer understanding. That was quite a hot topic at the end of the previous session. And you can find links to both those blogs on our financial services landing page, and the video is available on demand too. So today, we're going to talk about another key component of continuous improvement, and that is culture. And in a strong consumer duty culture, you can rely on your colleagues that they are all going to be working to the same ends, and that's to make things better for customers. So before I pass over to Ed, please, as always, put your thoughts and your questions into the questions panel. I'll be keeping my eye on them, and we'll come back to them at the end. So over to you, Ed.
So thanks, Stu, and thanks to the CX team for putting this excellent topic on the webinar agenda. I wanted to start really with a thank you, and thank you to all the firms that I know have been working really hard in advance of the deadline of the end of the month. We have seen some really great work across firms in terms of putting in place the governance and the processes for that deadline to be met. And I know that the consumer duty expects high standards of firms, but I think it's right that we should do so, and that you should strive to continue to meet them. When Parliament set the consumer duty legislation in place, we knew we had a task ahead of us, but actually the industry has worked hard, and in my experience, embraced the duty really well. So it's a thank you to the firms, and thank you also to consultancies like CX Partners who've done a lot of work to promote and unpack the duty, and particularly the customer perspective that CX Partners brings is really important, I think. So I think it's important. I know we're all rushing to meet the deadline, but it's important that we take a step back and think really about what the duty is driving at. And as Stu says, this is not a one-shot compliance exercise game. This is the duty should be at the heart of everything that firms do really going forward. So it's an embedding exercise and a journey of continuous improvement, as Stu mentioned. I mean, the common thread, the thing that we are interested in above all else, in our work is reducing harm to consumers and ensuring that firms deliver good outcomes for consumers. I think, as you know, as we said previously, the duty's outcomes really run with the grain of what good firms should seek to deliver. In our experience, those firms that do the right thing and show leadership should welcome the kind of action that the duty embeds to tackle poor practice by competitors who drive down standards and drive down trust amongst consumers. So in some senses, firms should realise that if they get the implementation of the duty right, they deepen their trust with customers and they deliver better outcomes for people and for themselves, for the businesses at heart. You know, we want consumers to buy insurance and take out mortgages and borrow credit sensibly and invest in the future, but they do so knowing that firms are providing them with the right products and supporting them to meet their needs. So I think, in a sense, there's a win-win circle here, and I'm sure firms, you know, are adopting that approach to it. So my first message: ultimately, the duty is not only good for the consumer, but good for growth and the bottom line in the industry as well. My second main message today is, again, going back to Stu's earlier comments, the implementation of the consumer duty is not a one-shot tick box compliance exercise. I know it might feel like that a bit in the current circumstances where you're, you know, trying to meet milestones and get things in place for day one. But actually, it's a much longer game than that. And it's about changing, ultimately, fundamentally changing the mindsets of firms and changing the culture in firms, which is what the webinar is about today. You know, in our experience, and I know we bang the drum a lot about culture, but it's because culture is a key driver of consumer outcomes and good consumer outcomes. You know, when firms have a healthy culture aligned with their customers' interests, that kind of flows through the business and can really sort of act as a powerful safeguard against harm to consumers and so forth. So what really drives outcomes for consumers is the culture of the firm, and that means the leadership, the governance, the people in the firm, and how they approach their day-to-day activities. And so ultimately, from a longer term perspective, what firms should be asking themselves in relation to the duty is, does your purpose and culture align with your obligations under the duty? Does it support the delivery of good outcomes to consumers? Is the duty being considered in all relevant discussions, such as strategy, remuneration, and risk? And I know John T will come on to some of that. Have you made sure your REM structures, your incentive structures drive good outcomes for customers? And are you prioritizing good outcomes for customers in a changing external environment? So when you talk about strategy, for example, are you thinking about what are the kind of key things that we need to get right for those customer outcomes, those good customer outcomes? So culture starts with leadership and purpose, and you know, a lot of the publications we've done around culture have really explored those two concepts. Leaders set the tone from the top, and they shape culture through the way that they manage staff behaviour across the firm, and it really that needs to be integral for the leaders to set those standards among staff. Encouraging firms to staff to speak up, in particular, speak up culture is a really important part of that leadership. So when, you know, staff see consumers getting poor outcomes, or they fear that there might be a risk of that, they've got strong incentives to speak up, and that they're actually genuinely listened to in the organisation. Senior managers have an important role to play too in setting that culture. Under our SMCR regime, our senior managers regime, those senior managers have personal accountability for ensuring that their area is controlled effectively and complies with regulatory standards. So again, this is about senior leaders setting the right tone around the duty and fostering a consumer-focused culture amongst their staff. So culture is firstly leadership and purpose, but also it's about people policies and setting the right incentives is really crucial to establishing the right culture in amongst staff. I think it's important that staff understand the duty and how it applies to their day-to-day roles. And we've seen really good examples, I think, in our implementation review of firms, of where firms have kind of sought to roll out consumer duty training to different staff, sought to make that relevant to different staff roles and how it applies to their job. To complement that, we've also introduced a new conduct rule, which is linked to the consumer duty, which will apply like our other conduct rules to almost everyone in the firm. And that requires staff to act to deliver good outcomes for retail consumers, where the activities of the firm fall within the scope of the duty. So, it's in a sense important that your staff understand that and that they respond to training and understand what that conduct rule sets. Setting the right, I mentioned incentives before, and I think it is really important that as part of the duty, you're setting the right incentives around staff, and it can be hugely important about how they react to incentives and behaviour and setting behavioural standards. So at worst, incentives can drive and even reinforce bad behaviour. But examples in the past we've seen in consumer credit where sales-based incentives and volumes have led to products being sold inappropriately, creating a risk of harm to consumers. So, and they cannot, that problem of incentives can be magnified if you're also setting incentives on managers to hit sales targets, and then they get magnified through the organisation. So they do play quite a key role, and we want firms really to look at incentives in the round at all levels of the organisation to make sure that they're properly structured in a way that delivers good consumer outcomes, and that there is a proper, balanced scorecard around performance that incentivises behaviour in line with the duties. So, as I said, we have seen some really good practice. We've seen training in firms rolling out. We've seen firms setting out its plans to explain its purpose and the values in a way that's been aligned to the consumer duty and delivering good consumer outcomes. We've seen examples of internal cultural and training materials that firms have used. So there's really good work going on, and I also really echo the work that CX have been doing in this area as well. The final way in which I think firms should ensure the duty is embedded into its culture is really through its approach to governance and oversight processes. So obviously a lot of work is targeted at the product governance level and the product oversight committees that firms use to set their strategies for the products and ensure those products are still being used appropriately. So a lot of the work in implementing it and reviewing the products has gone on at that sort of level, and that's really important. It's really important that those product committees and product governance processes are reviewing products on a regular basis to ensure that throughout the life cycle of those products, they're continuing to meet consumer needs and giving consumers good outcomes. It's also, I think, important that the duty needs to be part of the risk and audit functions within certainly larger firms, so that they're focused on that and understand how that's rolling out across the business, understand the risks and how they're being managed through the business. But ultimately, it's also at the board level. And we've really set great store by the board being the champion of the duty. We've actually appointed, we want firms to appoint a board level champion for the consumer duty. And that's because I think, again, it reflects this tone from the top. Boards are ultimately accountable. We expect them to be embedding that and overseeing that embedding of the duty across the organisation. So, we've set out rules that every firm must assess, whether every board level assessment of whether they're delivering good consumer outcomes at least annually. The board needs to review that. They need to make changes to products where necessary, and then they sign it off. So boards played a really central role in sort of establishing that culture and that rhythm of reviewing the duty over time. Again, that's part of the culture of the oversight and the governance of the firm. Again, we've seen many good practices in our review of implementation. We've seen some really good, robust governance frameworks that firms have set out with sorts of evidence that that firms and boards will be seeking to actually verify that the duty is being complied with and implemented effectively, and also some number of boards looking and reviewing at the cultural level what the cultural indicators are within the firm about how the duty is being embedded. So again, some really good examples, and I know from my experience that there's a lot of boards that have been thinking quite deeply about how they assess the duty and the implementation, and particularly how they push towards a consumer duty focused culture. So I'm going to stop there, but before I do, I just wanted to summarize what I think are the three key messages that I wanted to impart today, and then hand over to Stu and John to take it further. But firstly, I think ultimately the duty is a culture shift. It's a culture shift for us as well as for firms. We will be focused as much now on the outcomes for consumers as well as on the rules and processes and so forth that we've focused on before. So there's a culture shift for us, but it's a culture shift for firms. And I think while implementation to date has been focused on necessarily, I guess, on the milestones and compliance products, it's really important to understand that this is not a one-off compliance exercise. It's not a compliance tick box. It's about ultimately embedding duty into the culture of the firm. The second key message is I think that is good for the commercial bottom line of the firm. I think building trust with your customers has shown to drive commercial growth as well as achieving good consumer outcomes. And I think lots of firms who do this well, implement it well, will experience that upside. And finally, I think it's easy to get caught up in the detail and the milestones of the consumer duty and the particular outcomes that the duty requires firms to focus on. But ultimately, it's about understanding your customers, how they use your products, and how you can best help them to achieve their financial goals and avoid harm. So, so I'll stop there and hand over to Stu.
Brilliant. Thank you for that, Ed. Three really good, succinct messages, I think, for us to remember there. And just a reminder for everyone, we'll be having time for questions at the end. So if you have questions for Ed or for Jonty, that matter, just get them in the chat. And just bringing up the slides for Jonty to take over. Let me know when you're good.
Thank you, Stu, and thank you, Ed. I'm Jonty Dalell-Small. I'm a psychologist working at Sopra Steria, which, as Stu said, is the parent company of CX Partners, one of the UK's leading user-centered design agencies. So I'm a psychologist here at Sopra Steria and very much a user-centered design, human-centered design thinker. My background is an organizational psychologist, and I lead our behavioral science work here. So very much involved in how do you apply behavioral insights to complex challenges. And that's what we'll be talking about today. How do you actually bring to life a consumer duty culture in your firm? So I'll be taking you through for the next 15, 20 minutes, our framework for how you design, test, and then deploy a framework to measure and create a consumer duty culture. Requested control, Stu, but it's not, there we go. So as Stu said at the start of this call, this webinar, previously CX Partners, we've talked about how the inner circle of this model, very much about taking qualitative insights, listening better to customers. And as Ed said right at the end of his presentation just then, fundamentally the consumer duty begins with understanding customers. So there's that inner ring of listening to customers to improve outcomes sooner. Whereas today we'll be looking at this complementary outer ring. How do you actually build the culture that can improve these outcomes in this way? moving forward.
Would you like me to skip the slides
A
forward?
little clunky, yes.
You might just give me a little prompt when you want to move on.
Now, please. So we'll be taking you through what we think of as a relatively simple framework for a complex challenge. And the message here is it's very tempting with complex challenges to try different initiatives, go in different directions, so to throw spaghetti at the wall and see what sticks. Whereas actually it's always helpful to have a framework, an organizing framework to design your initiatives around. And on the next slide, please, Stu. Here I'm taking inspiration from two quotes today from Kurt Lewin, who's the godfather of social psychology, who said, "There's nothing as practical as a good theory." So we have this model, this theory of how we think you can start to sort of look at what's in your organizational culture to design for those outcomes, which are both good for the FCA, good for the consumer duty, and also good for your firm. So I'm going to request remote control against you because this is... Okay, so this is the top. This is the top of our consumer duty model. As we say, it's an integrated model, and it does start by really focusing on the consumer duty outcomes. Why everyone's here today, but this just moving around. But actually, at the start of our model is about thinking about how the consumer duty outcomes are nested in business outcomes. So as Ed eloquently put it, this is about the win-wins between what's good for the consumer duty outcomes. Having trusting relationships with your customers, for example, is good for the bottom line as well. So it's about fleshing that out. Beneath that sits what we'll identify as the target behaviors. This is behavioral science. It's very much about getting granular and getting actionable. What are the behaviors that you need to see in your firm to lead to those outcomes? And helpfully here, and here we go. Helpfully here, we'll be using the categories which the FCA has provided in terms of the things which Ed just mentioned, in terms of the purpose of your organization, how leadership behave, what they do, the tone from the top, those governance processes, and the people in the organization as well. So we can identify those specific target behaviors. Beneath that sits the actual culture of your firm, many of the things which often feel sort of intangible and the like, things like your values and assumptions that people carry around in their heads, but which really shape people's behaviors. And we're bringing this down to the bottom level of enabling factors. What are the levers you can draw on? And once again here, we'll be using the categories which the FCA has provided to structure the initiatives which you can bring to bear in your firm. How do you operationalize this model? What does consumer duty excellence look like? We can lay out this model in terms of, first of all, starting to think about the outcomes, then getting into the culture, then you want to measure the interventions which you're bringing to bear in your organization, doing this in a way of an actual toolkit, using the human-centered design approach of experimental approaches as well. Yes, there is best practice, but your organization will have its own nuances and challenges, which is very important to understand, to keep testing and keep learning. As Ed said, this isn't a one-stop shop. This isn't just a tick box exercise in compliance. To really embed and keep building a consumer duty culture, you will need to work in an experimental, iterative way, seeing what works in your firm, and then, yes, getting feedback from customers, getting feedback from internal colleagues as well, to see what's working, what's motivating them to embed the consumer duty culture. As we operationalize that model, it starts with clarifying and aligning consumer duty and business outcomes. We then identify the key target behaviors that will bring about those outcomes. We then develop enabling factors which will lead to those behaviors, but also really understand your organizational culture. Where might it be working against the consumer duty objectives at the moment? We then measure the degree in which those barriers show up and what the opportunities are before putting into practice in that pilot, iterate and scale approach. Before we come full circle, everyone on this call who represents a financial services firm will need to demonstrate in your annual review with the FCA the progress you've been made. And the beauty of this model is that by coming full circle, you're always looking for evidence. Are the interventions working? Where have you made progress? Where can you show fantastic efforts to deliver ever better consumer duty outcomes? And then where can you also build your backlog of initiatives to keep driving that continuous improvement and embedding the culture? To bring this to life, we prepared a quick whistle-stop tour. I found the wrong whistle-stop tour of how we put this into practice. So that top level starts with those business outcomes. The consumer duty outcomes are clear: the product and service, price and value, consumer understanding, and consumer support aspects of the duty. But once again, to underscore, you should be thinking about these as being nested within the business outcomes that you want to see. Yes, regulatory compliance, fulfilling those duties, but also thinking about the bottom line, how you're creating value, and social value could be on here as well, other benefits from the consumer duty outcomes. How you'll be enhancing your customer experience, your brand and reputation by fulfilling the consumer duty outcomes, but also looking at the colleague experience. Some of the companies we're working with are seeing how actually helping colleagues connect with their own sense of purpose, their own intrinsic motivation about doing the right thing for consumers is enhancing their internal employee experience widely. So that has fantastic benefits in terms of retaining and attracting the talent you want to see in your organization. So you create that robust link between your firm's objectives and the consumer duty objectives. And if there's one message we'd like to take away today, is like, do not pass go almost. Stop at this point if you don't have that clear line of sight to those performance outcomes. This is true for building a consumer duty culture, but it's also true for culture change programs in general. Often culture change programs fail if it's a free-for-all, if there's no clear definition of the outcomes that you're aiming for. It means that you may really struggle, sign off in your organization, motivating people around this different approach. But also people perceive this, if you don't have that clear line of sight to why it's good for your firm, the corporate antibodies come out to attack something as foreign and new, whereas in fact it should be embraced as something which you can take on and really enhance your firm. So get your performance outcomes clear at the top. So you're starting to link the consumer duty outcomes, which the FCA have described, with your firm's outcomes. We move on to the next stage of identifying those key target behaviors. Here, I've given some sample things which we're seeing in our work across financial services. And I've grouped these into those very useful buckets which the FCA has provided: governance, people, purpose, and leadership. I won't go into these too much, but you might think, just to pull one or two out, in terms of people. I'm a behavioral scientist, and many people have heard of the concept of nudging, how you might take away friction, help people to do the right things by having less barriers in their way. Whereas often you might see sludge in organizations. Where in your firm are sort of processes or products adding in friction, which are leading to bad consumer duty outcomes, consumer outcomes? Are your people being proactive? Are they calling out sludge when they see it? Are they challenging each other? Are they taking ownership? So you can actually start to get really very granular about the types of behaviors that you will need to see. And then once you've got granular, you want to get actionable. Write behavioral statements to actually define, who do you need, what's the action you need to see in your people, what's the behavior you need to see, and then start to think about how you might get data and measurements to say, are these behaviors actually showing up in our organization at the moment? So once again, culture can seem to be this fuzzy, intangible thing, but the trick here is to think very specifically about how are people behaving now. How would we like them to behave in the future to fulfill the duty outcomes and also for the good of the firm? And then to say, how can we close that gap to actually bring those behaviors to life? So we've thought about the outcomes. We're starting to think about the culture in terms of behaviors. And then you can start to say, what would enable those behaviors in practice? What would actually lead to developing this consumer duty culture? So this is a starting point which the FCA has given you in the guidance, and which Ed has reiterated today. Use these buckets, start to think about how these factors are showing up in your organization at the moment and how you could do more of these good things. Once you've got those enabling factors, you then actually get to the nuts and bolts almost of the culture which you work in, because these things can be described in the guidance, they can be described in quite abstract terms. What you need to do at this stage is really understand your own organizational culture and think, okay, looks good on a PowerPoint slide, but where might our culture work against the consumer duty objectives? So here it is about understanding behaviors in context. And one of my favorite examples of sort of applied behavioral science and design is the challenge which retail banks had a few years ago, maybe a few decades ago now, of people going to the cash machine, taking their money and walking off and leaving their card behind. This problem happened for a while, and people on this call will probably tell me more about the extent of this problem than I know. But obviously, bad idea for people to be walking off with cars, people that get stolen, and all sorts of fraud, bad outcomes for consumers as part of the process. But it was only when people actually went and looked and said, observed the behavior and context, did the penny drop, what if we redesign the process so that rather than getting your cash first, we give people their card first, because no one's going to walk off without their money, thereby cutting down on the fraud and the losses to the firms, and yes, leading to better consumer outcomes in the process. So when you're thinking about where your organizational culture will work against the consumer duty outcomes, you need to get out there and study the behaviors in context and think of it as a similar design challenge. Some of the sample organizational challenges that we've experienced and the cultural challenges that you may be seeing in your organization at the moment, and can typically think about, this urgency trap. People in financial services firms, we talk about, this sprint to the finishing line, but it's actually a marathon. The consumer duty outcomes, you need to keep on embedding it. But often in financial services firms, there does seem to be this urgency trap. Very good at responding to a burning bridge, but not necessarily prioritizing the longer term, more important work. And definitely building towards consumer duty outcomes and embedding that culture is one of those, it is urgent, but maybe downgraded, but it's important in the long-term change, which you need to see. You don't want it to be squeezed out. Another cultural challenge that we see is that a tick box culture. And Ed referred to this as well. Firms thinking, well, we can comply, that's that. The consumer duty culture is very different. So beware of those challenges in your organization about, pressures to execute, deliver, and comply, which may well then lead to shallow, unethical consumer duty culture at best. Doing so well, moving forward. So here we go again. Okay, right. There's also a cultural challenge sometimes in organizations about a desire for a silver bullet. As we said, we're very mindful, this is a complex challenge, so you need that simple organizing framework. But beware the tendency, the mindset of jumping to a technical solution or a process change. Governance and processes are so important, but don't fall into the trap of oversimplifying the complex changes that will be needed over a period of time to sustain this in your organization. And then finally, in terms of the cultural challenges that we're seeing, is everything is scary. Here I am as a psychologist, talking to financial services. This people stuff may not necessarily come naturally to some of you on this call. It seems like, how can we make this as less scary as possible? And a testament to the FCA and the way Ed is describing it as well, the consumer duty is an opportunity, but people will be in a defensive mindset, seeing this as a threat rather than an opportunity. And so the way in which you approach that challenges will have to be handled carefully and planned for as well. Moving on so once you've looked at your culture, you think about the behaviors that will lead to the outcomes, what might enable those factors, and what the barriers are. The next step is then to measure what matters. How can you overcome the barriers and identify the hotspots in your organization? And by evidence, I mean being creative, looking at different sources, different complementary sources of evidence in your organization. Definitely take the sort of qualitative design thinking approach as well, of understanding how people in your organization are feeling, as well as your customers, the consumers, but also look for sources of organizational data, draw on the scientific literature and empirical findings. And then once you have those evidence and the target behaviors you want to address, you want to think about what hypotheses do we have? Where might we have existing evidence? Where might we need more data to intervene to build the consumer duty culture? In terms of measuring, we have a few slides looking at break it down into the different aspects in terms of people. So just to pick the one at the top, Ed mentioned training, and it's good practice for firms to be thinking about the ways in which you may be training staff internally to think about the consumer duty culture. As an organizational psychologist, I go further, though, and say training is fantastic, but you don't want to fall into the trap either of training becoming a tick box exercise either. From a business psychology perspective, what we really care about is transfer of training, something you might think about in terms of measuring, in terms of demonstrating compliance. Not just are you training people, but are they using those skills back in the workplace? Are they behaving in the way they need to behave to embed the culture? And then we have different ways in which we've been thinking about how you can measure what matters in terms of leaders. Are they demonstrating compliance? Are they embedding the culture? Are they championing behaviorally informed approaches for ever better outcomes in terms of continuous improvement? Is your purpose lined up? What might you measure there? Maybe tailoring existing tools that you use in your organization, pulse surveys, annual surveys of staff. Are you building into there? Are you measuring the gap between your values and behaviors and what's actually happening in action? Are you walking the talk in terms of the duty? And governance as well, some measurement ideas there as well. The final step in terms of operationalizing this model of consumer duty culture is about pilot and scaling interventions. My second and final quote from Kurt Lewin, the godfather of social psychology, not only was he correct to say there's nothing as practical as a good theory, but the best way to learn about an organization is to try and change it. Again, getting out of that defensive mindset. You may be finding that, well, how do I actually really start to embed a consumer duty? It's quite hard. Well, try and change things. Try and experiment in your organization to see what works. Take on that mindset, which we think is going to be fundamentally important to embedding a consumer duty culture over the long term. Because there really is no formula to creating a consumer duty culture. I'd love to be able to stand up here and say, you know what, Eureka, we've got it. This is the answer. There isn't a formula, I'm sorry to say, but what you can do, and the exciting fun part actually, is to test and learn in your context. Start to take small, impactful steps, get people to act differently. We know from psychology, people don't change their opinions, their mindset by being told to think differently. They actually change their mindset by acting differently and starting to internalize that different way of acting. But it's very much about getting actionable and starting to work on this great stuff. Take small steps, people start to think differently. They'll start to think differently if they're being defensive at the moment about the consumer duty and its outcomes. This will create those positive feedback loops for cultural change. Build your toolkit, start experimenting. And to do that, I'm getting really confused about which direction we're going. To do that, at the start of the session, Stu mentioned a blog which I wrote a few months ago, where we've actually designed a workshop which you can download and start working with your team. Go away today, put in 90 minutes next week with key people in your organization to start to understand what are the key aspects of your culture which support the duty. Which behaviors at the moment support the duty, and then where might you create maximum alignment between the two? So a very light touch, small step you can start taking next week by getting together key people in the organization to start to embed the consumer duty culture and really bring to the fore the importance of how people are behaving and thinking about this to ultimately create better outcomes for consumers and your firm. The other way in which you can start to test and learn in your context is to run a behavioral design sprint. So this is something we've been doing recently with firms, whereby here on the screen is a picture of these glorious men. This is Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, who sort of credited with creating the field of behavioral economics. And here they are enjoying themselves in California, but on the side they're also codifying their insights into how people make decisions, as popularized in books like Thinking Fast and Slow. What we do in a behavioral design sprint is spend a week looking at what are the behavioral, starting to prototype and design interventions that firms can start to put into practice at the end of the week to really get moving quickly, addressing those key behavioral challenges. So start to test and learn in your context. And then finally, we come full circle to the end of the wheel. This is the way in which you can practically start to put things into practice and then also start to measure, are the interventions actually delivering the outcomes? You can really then start to demonstrate in your annual review of the FCA, the process you've taken, how you're working through, and how you're giving this level of sort of sophistication in terms of how people are really behaving in your firm, and then build that backlog of ideas to drive further improvements in your firm. So bringing it all together, this is just our worked example of how you go from outcomes, aligning that, do not pass go unless you've really got a clear view about how the outcomes link with your firm's outcomes, why it is that win-win that Ed referred to. Do that deep dive into your culture, think about the behaviors you want to address, what might enable those behaviors, but also what might block them in terms of the barriers. Then start to create hypotheses which you can measure for really changing behavior in your organization. Do it in the form of an actual toolkit. Ideally, start to experiment, start to learn, start to change things so you really learn about what will work. Then come full circle to demonstrate progress, keep continually improvement, and keep continually aligning with the outcomes for the duty, but more importantly, how those outcomes align with what's important for your firm.
Thank you, Jonty. take a well-earned drink of water. So at the start of the session, I said I hoped you might find this an energizing interlude ahead of the deadline. Be interested to hear how you found it. We've had a couple of questions come in so far. I think these are both for you, Ed, so far. The first one is about consumer understanding, actually, I think, where a regulatory rule or policy does not result in a good customer outcome. For example, the customer doesn't understand the legal terminology. Are we able to use layman's terms instead if we can prove better customer outcomes, basically that the customer has better understanding?
The short answer, I think, is yes. I mean, there's very few prescriptions in our rule book about the way you need to phrase things, or particular. I mean, there's certain rules around having size of font, or sometimes it gets quite granular. But in terms of putting things in layman's terms, we're always very keen that that firms adopt the best language they can to get messages across to consumers. And part of the duty is really about that consumer understanding, and firms making sure that consumers are understood the messages, the key messages that firms put across to them. And if that means putting them in different formats, or putting them in layman's terms, or testing whether or not consumers understand that kind of language before sending it out, that's absolutely part of the duty, and shouldn't be the case that rules get in the way of that. There may be rules there for a sensible purpose, but they wouldn't be that prescriptive as to language in most cases, I think.
That one sort of speaks to me to a really common thing that we see through research, and something that Jonty mentioned there about firms understandably feeling defensive when there's a regulatory change, and their job is to, in some way, to protect the firm, or some people's roles are about protecting the firm, and that can lead to tensions internally between people who are delivering services to customers who can see themselves, a customer understands something, and somebody else who is prescribing to them, you have to use these words because we think these are legally correct, and there's a conflict there. I would assume my understanding of the consumer duty and everything you've been talked about is that what matters first and foremost is whether the customer achieved a good outcome, and everything else just flows back from there. Does that sound right?
It does. Yeah, that is right. I mean, and obviously there's different documents to some extent that go into a contract, and we're not talking contractual terms, but clearly in the key information that you impart to a consumer, the way you market that product, that needs to be absolutely clear as to the purpose of the product, and that how you're expecting consumers to use it. So underlying any product should be a good understanding of the purpose of the product and the need that it's meeting for customers, and therefore the target market that you're assuming, and any communication around that really should be in line with that target market, so that you're really trying to get the consumer to understand what the product is and how it's meeting their particular needs, and however best that's done under duty, and however best you test it, that's got to be the right approach.
Good. Thanks, Ed. Okay, the next question we've got, I think it's perhaps also for you, but it's on the main topic of culture. So, beyond the demonstration of improved outcomes for customers, is the FCA expecting any particular methodology for reporting on culture change? For example, dashboards versus more of a narrative to tell the story of what changed?
We've not been specific, and look, we understand that firms have different cultures, and that we're not prescriptive about the culture, apart from obviously saying that the culture has got to align with the duty and produce good consumer outcomes. But so we don't take the view that it can be overly prescriptive about a culture. But I think we have seen firms try to measure it through dashboards and metrics and so forth, and sometimes that does give interesting insights. I would be cautious about sort of going too far down that line, because sometimes you just get swamped by a deck of metrics and things like that. That it's very hard to see the picture of what's changing. But there is some value in that sort of approach. But equally, it's good to see the culture change in action. What are the stories that the leaders are telling? What's the narrative around it? How far is that being seen in the day-to-day actions and activities of staff? So it's a little bit of both, I think. And you can use metrics, but let's not pretend they're the whole answer.
And one of the things you said earlier, Ed, right at the top actually, about leadership, setting the right tone and setting a good example. One thing that we see a lot that's really powerful is when a senior manager or an exec observes research themselves quite regularly, quite predictably. They'll have some sort of epiphany or moment where they realize that their deeply held assumptions weren't or aren't being played out in front of them. And that's a sort of a moment that generates stories. And if the CEO or an influential senior leader has that experience, they will inevitably start talking about it. It's just a thing. Yeah. It's just a thing that happens. And when you see the senior people talking like that about the things that they've seen with their own eyes, what's really happening for customers, I think that sends a powerful signal and encourages other people to join in, to start to get involved in really getting a closer look at what's really happening for customers. Okay.
Yeah, I really agree with that. I think that the stories can be very powerful from what we've seen, and where leaders have driven that culture change. That stories have been central to some of that understanding. Yeah.
Okay, we've got another one, Ed. It's about culture. So in terms of the position on the 31st of July, to what extent would you expect firms to have progressed with embedding the duty and changing the culture, as opposed to just implementing change?
Well, I mean, I think we recognise that culture is not, something you can snap your fingers and it changes like that. So certainly, I referred to some examples of things that firms are doing to implement the duty and thinking around culture change as well, and starting that journey. And it has been a start of a journey. We're not pretending that we're going to suddenly arrive at that process at the end of July, but the sorts of things that we are seeing firms do now, the training of staff, I think is important. Staff understanding what their role is in relation to the duty, and how their role fits with the duty, and what it means to have the customer at the front of their mind in terms of the way that they do the work, and the customer outcome at the front of their mind. So firms are doing that. That's really important part of setting that journey on the right path. Leaders have been, as we've just talked about, telling stories about the duty and putting it at the heart of their strategies, and communicating that through the organisation. And again, the more they can see, staff can see their leaders and hear their leaders in that respect, I think the better to kicking it all off. And then, and I say, boards have started, again, putting that tone from the top, but also demanding to see, some of the work and lift the bonnet on some of the work that's gone into the duty. And, they're ultimately accountable for that, and they need to be driving that sort of accountability through the organisation. So again, that's where you start to change the culture, and you start to fashion expectations through the organisation. So I'm not pretending it's an overnight thing, but I think we've seen the good firms we've seen start that journey and make some progress on it already. And I think that over time it will be good. And I think you get to, over time you get a snowball effect. I think with some of these things, if you start on the right path, people will start anticipating what you want to see, and they'll start devising metrics or thinking about data or different ways, or exploring consumer journeys on their own part, and raising these things sort of organically in the organization. So it can snowball reasonably rapidly if you get the right tone and you set the right parameters around it.
Cool, thanks. And that's quite a nice segue into the next question actually. While Jonty was speaking, I was just reflecting on how important, he talked about feedback loops, essentially being able to measure, and that will generate evidence about things that work and also things that don't work. And it's legitimate if you're trying something new. It's legitimate that sometimes it won't work. And I think it sounded credible to me, Ed, at least, that the evidence of both the successes and the failures would be interesting to the FCA supervisor. They're showing somebody really embracing the spirit of the duty.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, we would really value organisations coming to us and say, look, we tried this. We tried it in really good faith. It didn't work, but these are the lessons we've learned from it, and this is how we're sort of adapting our consumer duty strategy in the light of that, or building things around it. It may be, for example, we're all exploring the consumer understanding issues around how they read different marketing materials, how they read different letters, whether or not they have the right effect on that. That's a constant process, and I think it'd be really, really valuable to have that conversation, and I hope we do have that conversation with firms to say, well, look, firm, we tried this communication, we thought the research said X, Y, and Z. Actually, it's a bit disappointing. The consumers didn't respond to it in the right way, or they did something different. That's absolutely valuable for us, and it's a lesson then we can impart to other firms in terms of that. So yeah, I think we do need to have that really kind of open conversation about some of this stuff, because we're not gonna mark firms down at all for trying.
Yeah, great. Okay, and so on a related note then, on the subject of, I guess, evidence, when measuring, this one's for Jonty, I think, when measuring culture, how do you establish the difference between correlation and causation? There are so many things that might influence colleague behavior. How do you isolate what is actually having the impact?
There are. This is why it's a complex challenge and multifaceted. Hence the framework. I think the first thing to say is, before we get to measuring culture, we should be taking that idea of understanding culture, identifying the things we want to address, then experimenting and iterating. And at that stage, we're not looking for statistical significance. Correlation, causation, you're starting to get into, when you actually crunch the numbers, where can you point to those factors? I think there's a step before then, which is start to test and experiment on a small scale to look for signal. Is this positive? Is there a positive signal? This looks like it might work. Negative signal, oh, maybe we're on the wrong track, or just no signal at all before you start to intervene. But then taking that behavioral science approach, behavioral science is called behavioral science because behavior is our outcome, but science is our process. So create your hypotheses by understanding what are the behaviors you want to target. Create those hypotheses based on the behaviors, but also the levers you want to try and pull, those things you're trying to isolate. And then, yes, try and identify with as few things as possible, few variables as possible to isolate it. But I wouldn't worry too much about correlation and causation at the moment. I'd worry about getting going, being actionable, showing progress. And actually, to the discussion just now, maybe build a backlog of, these are all the experiments, these are all the things we tried. That is the true side of a real culture that's embracing this. We tried lots of things, not all of them worked, but that's how serious we're taking it. And it sounds like the FCA would be very welcome to sort of hearing about that approach.
So I'm hearing start small, put one foot in front of the other, take some small steps to walk before you run, and those kind of things as well. And actually, the workshop that you created, Jonty, I think is something that will help generate the ideas for those small steps. Am I right?
Absolutely.
Okay. I think we've got time for one final question. So this is a message for Ed and Jonty. As a regulated debt management firm, our offering is business process as a service. How do we seek to deliver good customer outcomes when we perform our services on behalf of our clients? It will typically be banks, building societies, and other financial services firms in relation to their lending products. Are we responsible for the changing culture of our clients, or is it best practice to demonstrate a recommendation on how the culture should be? And that's perhaps more for you, Ed.
I mean, obviously, you can, in terms of culture and a firm, for a debt management firm, it's really, it's really important that you're dealing quite often with some vulnerable customers, and that you understand those customers. And so the duty, I think, is a really important cultural facet that for those kind of firms should really focus on embedding. Obviously, you can only embed or change culture in your own firm. You can't change culture in a client or an upstream firm that's supplying you with product as well. But what we have said in the duty is, we really do encourage firms to talk to our suppliers, upstream, downstream, distributors, for them to understand what your analysis of good consumer outcomes is, and where you think the target market is for your products, and the sorts of marketing materials that they should be using to target that target market, and also talk upstream to any suppliers that supply you to make sure that they've thought about the duty, right, and in the sorts of products that they're putting forward, and that you kind of understood that as well. So there is that supply chain aspect to the duty that firms should be looking up and down in terms of the overall outcome for consumers, and having those conversations. We have said, if you are concerned about a distributor or a supplier in your supply chain not complying with the duty or so forth, obviously have conversations with them, try and influence them. But if ultimately you can't make progress with that, then let us know, because it's important that this is seen through the supply chain. I'll stop.
Great, thank you, Ed. Okay, we do have more questions, but we're just about at the hour, so I think we'll wrap it up there. If anybody has got any more questions, of course, get in touch with us. We'd love to hear your challenges, and if we can help, we would love to do so too. In the next few days, we'll be sharing a link to the recording, the video recording of this session, and we'll be sending out some links, some of the blogs and thought pieces and templates that we've talked about in the session today. So thanks very much to Jonty, and thanks very much to Ed for joining us, and thank you for coming and for all of your questions. There's been some really good ones today. Obviously, a lot more to say about this subject. But for now, thanks very much, and enjoy the rest of your day.